All right, thanks so much. Very happy to have you all here today. My name is Renee Black. I am the founder of Goodbot Society. I am based in Vancouver, BC, and I am very happy to introduce a webinar series that we have just begun running. This is our second episode in that series called Design for Integrity. And the idea behind this is how do we think intentionally about the internet that we want? How do we think about the digital experiences that we want? How do we design for a more human-centric future? So I come from a little bit more of a pro-social design background, but of course, privacy is the foundation of all the things that I think work well on the internet, and that is both in terms of the surveillance around corporate, but also in terms of the government. And what is happening right now is a conversation that's been revisited for many years right now, and I'm very happy today to have a couple of folks that are experts in this topic joining me to discuss Bill C-22 and lawful access and where we are at this moment in time and how we got to this point. Before we get started, I actually do want to, first of all, just start out by acknowledging that actually myself, Matt, and it turns out Robert are all based in Vancouver on the unceded territories of this Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation. I think it's the first time I've actually been in a webinar with all three people from Vancouver, so that's kind of fun. Although Matt is in New York right now, I as we are thinking about these bigger questions around internet and around the way that powers are being exerted, I think it's also important for us to be mindful around, and as we are thinking about the way that digital sovereignty ends up playing out, how do we think through intentionally about how we also advance indigenous digital sovereignty for communities that have been pursuing this for a long time. So this is a call that's going to come throughout the Design for Integrity workshops in the coming year. I also want to thank our sponsors. We have the Council on Technology and Social Cohesion is a network of organizations that work on intersecting the sort of practices around peace building and pro-social design governance in technology. They're a great group of people who are thinking very thoughtfully about how do we design good products that help to bring people together. And this series wouldn't be possible without them. So a very big thanks to them. They're hosting their big annual seminar today, so they can't be here. All right, all that out of the way. We are going to have also Slido. So if you do want to ask questions along the way, we're going to be dropping the Slido link into the channel here. So please feel free to engage. Please, you're welcome to interact in the channel, but the questions that we're going to be fielding, we are going to do through the Slido. So please just go there. Without further ado, I really want to thank Matt and Robert for being here today on short notice. This event came together on Sunday, and all of y'all got here on 4 days notice. So just thank you all for making the time. It's a really important topic. It's very timely. Matt has been running open media for a couple of years now. We actually met when I was interviewing for his job a couple of years ago. I was working on the public safety side, so we actually have come at some of these issues from different points of view over time. I met Robert today, so that was very exciting and very happy to have them both here to talk about this really important topic. Matt, maybe I'll just let you take a moment to introduce yourself and how you come to these issues.
Yeah, how do I come to these issues? I mean, kind of like you said, both in great haste, due to how the government's forced us to approach this, and also as a multi-decade process. As I think Robert will tell us, we keep being forced into rush moments around this issue that in some ways always stays the same, which is, as many of us know, you cannot have a door into privacy that is just for good guys or just for a particular actor that you have chosen. When you make these kind of breaks into private communication, those doors can be found and discovered and abused by just about anyone. So I come into this work originally from the free expression community, doing a lot of work around sliding democracies globally. I worked with IFEX for many years. I brought it home to Canada to work on some of our expression and privacy here issues at a time that's proven to be a lot more relevant than I would like it to be. And we at Open Media, we've been doing this work as an organization and as a community for about 15 years. We've got about 230,000 people in Canada in our community in one way or another currently. And we've come from a lot of diverse perspectives. There's the full political spectrum in our community, but we're united in the belief in some core freedoms and values around digital spaces. So the value of privacy, of freedom, of expression, of democracy, and of equitable access for all. And with that, I will pass to Robert.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Renee. Thank you for inviting me to this meeting. This is terrific to see the interest in the bill. So I am a Vancouver criminal lawyer, many years back, and I started teaching at the law school at Thompson Rivers in Kamloops, British Columbia, which is about 350 kilometers north of here. And at Thompson Rivers, I teach criminal law and evidence, and I've developed, an interest in Section 8, and I've co-authored a whole book on it. So that's the section of the charter that guarantees us a right to privacy. And so that's how I've entered the conversation around Bill C-2 initially, and then Bill C-22. And so I'll have more, I think, to say about the constitutional dimension of this than anything else.
Thanks so much. Okay, so th this moment is an interesting one because this is not the first time that the government has tried to pass this bill. I think this is the fifth attempt at passing some version of lawful access since 2025. But this moment does seem to be in some ways more significant. There's been a number of companies that have basically threatened to leave Canada, including Signal, including Canadian VPN providers. There's been letters from the U.S. House Judiciary and Foreign Affairs committees warning about the threats that it poses to their national security. 200,000 members of businesses across Canada signed letters about the concerns that they have. A lot of individuals, privacy experts, security experts have expressed concerns around how this is going to impact privacy and security. So it does have this very big, broad, coalition of people who are very concerned about where it's going. So I guess that all this begs the question of why is the government pursuing this bill? Where does it come from, and how do we get to this place right now? And maybe we'll kick off with you, Robert, on that question.
Sure, yeah. So where does it come from? Why have they made five attempts? I mean, if you go far back enough, there were efforts to pass legislation like this as far at least as the 90s, but the real kind of momentum was gained after 9/11, when governments or liberal governments across the West passed um, extraordinary legislation, using not the pretext, but using sort of the mood and the fears around terrorism to justify to pass more invasive measures that in the climate of the time seemed acceptable. And so various powers were brought into law in the States and in Britain and in Australia and New Zealand. But over time, most of those countries, I'll come to the United States in a minute, most of those countries, well, those three countries, the three Commonwealth countries, um, uh, started to have legislation more or less like the legislation we're seeking. So, two or three components. One would be the power to tell companies like TELUS and Shaw, internet service providers or electronic service providers more broadly, to tell them to make modifications to their equipment that would make it easier for law enforcement or intelligence when they have a warrant or other authority like exigent circumstances to gain direct access to our data, private data held by those third parties. And so that was one part of it. Another part is just on a kind of day-to-day basis when police are investigating kind of common crimes like possession of child pornography or more serious, well, that's a very serious crime, but I have in mind here murder or big drug conspiracies and so on. One of the things they need to do is they may have information, they may have an IP address, they may have a phone number, or they may have a location, like the murder happened here, and we want, there are no witnesses and so on, and we want to ascertain if, what cell phones may have been in use within this 2 hour window and so on. So that's where the story begins for a lot of these powers. And well, one headache, but not a an absolute impediment is how do how do we obtain a number, or if we have a number like an IP address, how do we find out the person that is connected to it. So first we have to kind of blindly knock on doors. Like, was it TELUS that this served this IP address? Was it Shaw and so on? So one dimension of this is that they want that all to be made faster and easier by being able to ask Shaw or TELUS, did you serve this number? Do you have an account for this number? Because then they wouldn't have to, traipse across the country asking every service provider. They would know. And ideally, they want the power without any grounds, without having to get a warrant. But the law is fairly settled in Canada that they need a warrant or some grounds to go any further, to get to attach a name to that number and to have data disclosed. We'll come back to that. But so in those three other countries, there are already kind of more easier ways to obtain that information. There are powers in law that allow police to do that. So, police and intelligence here are envious that we don't have similar powers and they want more. I'll come back to, maybe later we can talk about this. I'll come back to why we don't have them and what stands in the way of Parliament just giving police and CSIS those powers. And the short answer there is the court and the whole jurisprudence that we have developed that's unique to Canada around constitutional privacy. So it works differently in Canada than it does in America and Britain and Australia, for reasons that have to do with the way we developed our own law around that. Um, um, I can't recall maybe the third one, sorry, is metadata retention. So there are metadata retention powers in Australia and the United Kingdom that Canadian authorities would like, and the Department of Justice wants. And so we're gonna talk about that in a bit. But I'll just say very briefly that I'll signal that was not a part of Bill C-2. So this, when they saw Bill C-2, tabled it in the summer, they didn't ask for a bulk metadata preservation power, and then it appeared in this round of the bill, which has given rise to many questions as to why. And I've got two theories as to why. Like one is legal, one is political. But I'll just end this kind of overview by saying that one recurring theme, if you do kind of look back historically at the several attempts that have been made to table lawful access legislation in Canada, what you'll find is that the attempt is made. There's always sort of an attempt to take advantage of positive or ideal political circumstances. So, I mean, the paradigm case would be 9/11. 9/11 happens, and people are afraid that there's going to be another similar attack in the near future on the same or greater scale, and they're prepared to give up all sorts of freedoms. So it's in that climate that we pass, legislation that does all sorts of things that diminish our freedoms. In 2012, when there was a big debate around this, I believe it's 2012 when Vic Taves, the conservative public safety minister, made the famous statement that you're either with us or you're with the child pornographers. And so, there was something of a moral panic about around those issues, and that was an attempt to take advantage of them. You might recall the wave of like homegrown terrorism that happened, and like the attack on Parliament and stuff around 2015, and around that time, more attempts were made to pass it. More recently, last summer, it was Trump making demands about us beefing up, border security, and that's what Bill C-2 was. It was the Strong Borders Act, and then it was all about immigration and protecting the border, and then half of the bill was all these powers that had nothing to do with the border, but nevertheless. Someone at the Department of Justice, the deputy minister, thought this is the right time. Let's try and jam this through. But every time the government has tried to do this, despite the fact that there is a public appetite, given some panic at the time, there has been enough of a vocal opposition among people who care about privacy and are following the issue closely, that they had backed down. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't look as though they are going to back down. We can once again talk about that. What is the likely further direction of this bill? Now that Carney has a majority, I think we're too far down the road, and there has been, I think, enough consultation of all the various stakeholders, including folks like us who are very concerned about privacy, for the government to abandon it now. I'd be very surprised if they did. If anything, yesterday the Minister of Public Safety was making statements to the effect that, okay, well, we're open to making changes and we'll make changes, but I think it's going to go ahead. So I'll stop there.
Good. So yeah, I mean, I think now we're in this moment of C22, and this has been an issue that has kind of fired up civil liberties groups a lot in the past, and it was a bit slow, kind of getting the public attention that it has right now, but attention has come in the last couple of weeks, and so we are at a slightly different moment in time. Matt, can you talk a little bit about like how we got to this, like how it got to this point actually, and what you think is important at this moment, and we're going to come back to some of the basics around C22 in a moment, but yeah.
Yeah, so much to talk about here. I think fairly obviously we haven't had, and it's wonderful that we haven't had some terrible terrorist attack that is being used as a justification for this bill. C2, the explanation was supposed to be about what the Americans wanted, and that was true to some degree around some of the border portions. It now seems it was not necessarily true around some of these surveillance powers, and if anything, the Americans are a bit concerned about how far some of this goes. I think the opportunity that they're trying to take advantage of here is distraction, is the fact that we are all so inundated and overwhelmed by the news cycle. People want to believe that Prime Minister Carney has a firm hand on what needs to be done for Canada. And even when we learn from a news story, wow, this doesn't really seem like a good idea, I'm not sure the government fully grasps or is doing the right thing here. We have a tendency to turn away at this moment. People are scared, they're overwhelmed, and they can't handle another bad thing to fully wrap their hands around, especially one that is genuinely complex and that has, yes, some genuine competing public interests. The public does have an interest in public safety and in crime investigation. However, I think as we go further into it, we'll see that in some ways Canada's stab at what the government has portrayed as catching up to other Five Eyes countries around these powers, we're actually leapfrogging them at times and doing things that are quite extraordinary, broad in certain ways that, to my knowledge, I don't think any of the other Five Eyes do quite the mix of powers that are here. And certainly, I think we are doing some of this at a very dangerous time. I think the dirty secret of cybersecurity has always been not that we have amazing cybersecurity everywhere. It's that attacks are difficult and expensive and require specialized knowledge. Not that many people can do them. And a lot of the time, we're just kind of getting by without a human finding the opportunity to attack a place. Well, enter generative AI. Suddenly, Mythos and its successors are going to be powering a whole new wave of cybersecurity attacks. And I personally find it rather extraordinary that at a time that most of the world seems to be doing their absolute best to patch up cybersecurity vulnerabilities and prevent future attacks of this nature, Canada is saying, actually, we want to create more vulnerabilities, more attack surfaces in not just the telcos that are targeted by some of our allies, but actually in a currently sort of boundless number of service providers that may have some limitations or shape put on them by regulations later. But even if they do, the order-making powers will continue to apply both to what's called electronic service providers and core electronic service providers within the bill.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, why don't we jump into some of the specifics of what this bill can do? So, I mean, I know that there's components around the fact that you can be, Robert, you sort of alluded to the fact that you can target a phone number, but without necessarily a name attached to it. You can sort of target people without, as I understand it, any actual knowledge of a crime. It's sort of suspicion, as I understand it, so there's these kind of warrantless data collection components. There is the metadata collection. What is particular? What was always there and what is new in this bill, and what parts of it are the most alarming, and maybe also Also, as you're jumping into that, what are the intersections that are the most alarming as well? Because I think there's ways that these bills compound the new provisions that are especially concerning.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
Rob.
Just to point out maybe like the three or four biggest ones. In the initial version of the bill C2, there was a power, the information demand power. There was a power to ask that for a police, given to police and CSIS, to ask anyone who provides a service in Canada. It was worded that broadly, so that could be your doctor, your therapist, etc. Um, in addition to an electronic service provider, whether you provide a service to this person, like, is this, is this person seeing you as a therapist? And also, when did you provide service where it was very invasive, and they didn't need a warrant. They just needed reasonable suspicion, which is not much. And so I think they were readily persuaded, the government, the Department of Justice, were readily persuaded that that is not likely going to withstand a charter challenge. And so they've amended that. This one sort of good news part of this story. They've amended that now, so it only applies to telecommunications service providers, and the power is limited to a yes or no answer to the question, do you provide this person a service? So, like, do they have an account with you? So that answers their real demand. Like, police were always justifying this when it was initially tabled, in terms of, we just want to be able to find out very quickly, did this phone number come from Shaw or Telus, and where was it, Winnipeg or Toronto? So there's that. Another power that is still controversial is a power. So right now, if police want to obtain anything from your your subscriber ID, which is to say, the name attaching to your internet account. So if I go and surf a website in Britain or in Toronto or whatever, it leaves a trail. It shows that a person with this IP address visited this website at 3 o'clock and so on. So police are often receive those IP addresses from around the world for various reasons. The most common is child pornography, and they're given to Canadian police, and then Canadian police have to figure out, okay, who is this person, who is distributing the illicit content, or who's engaged in crime, and they knock on. So one problem is, like, where is it coming from? Shaw, Telus. So they figure that out, and then in order to get Shaw or Telus to tell them whose account is this attached to, oh, it belongs to Robert or John and so on, they need a warrant. And right now they use a kind of general kind of warrant, a general production order for this, which it can only be obtained on probable grounds. So maybe there's a distinction worth drawing. So in the law, there are various standards. But most common in criminal law are probable grounds and reasonable suspicion, and they can be defined very simply as so let's get even more basic. There would be a hunch or a mere suspicion, which would be a mere possibility of something, a belief that something might be the case, just, in general. A reasonable suspicion, by contrast, is one where there's a reasonable possibility, more than a mere possibility, okay, a reasonable possibility. And then beyond that, there's the general standard for a warrant that's in the Fourth Amendment of the US Constitution, probable grounds. So that is a reasonable probability that something is the case. Not to go down the rabbit hole here, but just very briefly, you would think, okay, that must mean that it's something like it's more likely than not that if we that so and so has committed a crime, and we are likely to find evidence of the crime in the place we seek to search. Okay, that's the general idea. But the Supreme Court of Canada has said, well, it's not quite 50% plus one. It's not quite more likely than not. It's just more than a reasonable possibility. It's kind of like there's a substantial possibility or a strong possibility. Okay, but nevertheless, it's people widely accept that it's courts, judges widely accept that it's a substantial standard. It's not easy to meet. There are many, many cases. This goes on every day in courthouses across Canada, where the police went in, they had a warrant, they had probable grounds, and defense lawyers say, no, but you know what? The police did not, in fact, have what amounted to probable grounds. It was not enough. They should have had They really only had reasonable suspicion, and the law required them to have probable grounds. So police at the moment need probable grounds to obtain the name that attaches to these accounts. But that's by default because we never really created a special power for getting subscriber identification information. What we have is a case from 2014 called Spencer, where police asked for it. Like they knocked on Tellus's door and they said, can we have the name attaching to this account?" And what the court there said was, even though all that Tellus is handing over is someone's name, what they're really doing is they're unveiling, they're lifting, they're opening the curtain on a whole search history, and that's immensely private. So we've got to think of the subscriber ID not as a sort of like three-line, John Smith, 123 Maple Street. We've got to think of it as way more than that. And the court said there's an enormous degree of privacy attaching to that information because once you know that it's Bob, 123 Maple, who used this IP address, what you really know is like his whole life because he's got his whole search history through that. Okay, so the court has said you've got a very high privacy interest in this information, but it didn't tell us whether we need probable grounds or reasonable suspicion. But it kind of hinted that probably nothing less than probable grounds is enough. But that's where the story ended, and there's been no like amendments, nothing. So this is an attempt, yet another attempt. Every time they try to pass this law, they try and fix this. And what they've done is they've said, we think that the court will accept as reasonable that police can obtain this information on reasonable suspicion, on a warrant with reasonable suspicion. So you'd still have to go to a judge and say, look, there's a reasonable possibility that Robert over there is involved in all this nefarious activity online. Or at least we think it's Robert. We want to know who it is because all we've got is this number. So we can have a debate about whether the Supreme Court is going to buy that. And I'll just say briefly that whenever a law is challenged under Section 8 of the Charter, okay, which guarantees everyone a right to be secure against unreasonable search or seizure, the way that it works is the way I explain this to my students is the light doesn't go on over Section 8. Section 8 is not engaged. You don't have a right kick in a given scenario unless the thing over which the police seek to search or seize is something that is private, okay, that you have a reasonable privacy interest in. So every few years, every year or two, really, there's like some new funky situation where the court has to decide, well, to begin with, is this thing private? Okay, and I'm taking the time to explain this because this is a big part of the metadata story as well. So, in 20, in the Telus case in 2014, that was the question. Do you have a privacy interest in the mere subscriber identification information, your name and address, attaching to your internet service account? And the answer is yes, you do. You have a privacy interest and it's quite high. Okay. Another example would be in 2024, in a case called Bajkovic, the court had to answer the question, okay, wait a minute, do you even have a privacy interest in the IP address, the bare number? Can you imagine like they knock on Shaw's door and they say, can you give us the IP address of the guy who was surfing this website on Tuesday the 5th? And now the Supreme Court of Canada had to answer the question, do you have a privacy interest in those bare numbers? And the answer is yes, because once again, if you have those numbers, that opens the door to a whole search history. So you can't think in terms of those numbers alone. So every couple of years, there's like this kind of a debate. I could give you other examples, but I don't want to sidetrack us too much. So the first question to answer is there a privacy interest in the thing? And then, how great of an interest is it? I'll give you another example. Like when you go to the border, when you go to the border and, they want to look in your car, you go to the airport and they want to look in your bag. You have a privacy interest at the border, but it's a diminished interest. It's a lower interest than when the police knock on your door at your house. You also have, so anyway, I'll leave it there. Okay, so once they decide, yes, like that you have a privacy interest in the thing that they're seeking to search, your house, your body, your computer, okay? The light goes on, and then the question is, was the search reasonable? And one of the questions that the court asks is whether the law authorizing the search, okay, like the law that creates a warrant police can go get, whether the law authorizing the search is itself reasonable. Okay, and to answer that question, the court asks a big philosophical question. They say, does the law strike the right balance between um, the privacy interest at stake and the law enforcement interest? Okay, and so when this law, if this law is passed, if the reasonable suspicion to obtain subscriber ID power is passed, people will go to the Supreme Court of Canada and um, they will argue that a warrant on reasonable suspicion does not amount to a reasonable balance, does not strike the right balance between the high privacy interest here and the pressing but not as high law enforcement interest. Okay, here's the whole moral of the story. Every time there is that kind of a battle, okay, over whether the law is reasonable, it's often close. Not every time, but it's often close. And I think somebody backstage at the Department of Justice has made the calculation that the court at present, as it is currently constituted, is close enough to more or less evenly divided that it's almost a crapshoot as to whether they would find this power unreasonable and therefore unconstitutional. Okay. But if they do find it unreasonable, they will strike it down and it'll be gone. Okay. But that's not, briefly, again, I don't want to spend too much time on this. The last thing to say about it is, but that's not all they've done in C22 with the subscriber ID power. They've also said, so like you can't just get the name attaching to the IP address. They've thrown in they've squeezed in a whole bunch of other little things that they can ask for as well in the warrant. Like, okay, well, what devices did they use? What services are they obtaining through this subscriber ID? And I and others have said, that's definitely too much for reasonable suspicion. For that, they need probable grounds, a warrant on probable grounds. So that's one. That's two, sorry. Three, very briefly, the bulk metadata preservation power. And just because I'm taking up too much time here, don't want to cut Matt off here altogether. But so just briefly, unless Matt, you want to jump in.
You go ahead.
So the bulk metadata power, this is simply a power that the Minister of Public Safety will have to tell any electronic service provider or only, a small group of them that are very big, that are set out in a schedule to the Act, to tell them that they must preserve a record of the metadata attaching to pretty much anyone's communications. So there's a section of the bill that says, okay, that definitely does not include the content of your emails, texts, or your surf history, but it includes a lot of other things. And the way it's defined is open-ended. It doesn't say metadata means the following. It says metadata includes this. So it could mean lots of other things. So there's still going to be fights over what that is. But it certainly means information about when I used my phone, where I used it, and to whom I was communicating. And I think it captures a lot more. Like I think it would, depending on whether you're using SMS or whether you're using iMessage. I think if you're using SMS, it would capture like when you text and where you texted to and so forth. So I think it's quite invasive. The government is going to have the power to tell TELUS, Shaw, etc., that we want this preserved, everyone's data preserved for up to a year, with no grounds, no suspicion, nothing. So once again, the first question is, well, wait a minute, like how can this be okay? How can this be constitutional? And the government posts a charter statement whenever it tables a new bill that sets out its explanation of why or how it thinks everything it's proposing to pass in a given bill is consistent with the charter. And in the charter statement for Bill 22, nothing is said about the metadata power. Like they just don't, they assume it has nothing to do with Section 8. There are no problems. And um, my explanation of why is it's really straight. I think it's really quite straightforward. They think that the the demand on the part of the minister to Shaw or TELUS to hit the record button on all of my metadata, preserve it somewhere, store it like on that server over there, is not an interference with my privacy. Okay, um, so it's not that the data isn't private; it's that it doesn't involve an interference with privacy. And I should have mentioned that earlier. So that was kind of implied in my earlier explanation, right? Whenever so to engage Section 8, police, a state actor has to interfere with something over which you have a reasonable privacy interest. And I think the government's position here is that when the minister says, please record this for a year, that's not an interference with your privacy. The data is private, but they're saying, and they've said this at all the, all the discussions and all the press conferences, they've said, no, but we're not interfering with your privacy because we don't access it. We, the police, CSIS, we don't access it until we need it. We don't access it unless we have a warrant or other authority, exigent circumstances, and so on. But I don't think that's correct, and I say that for two reasons. I think so. One reason is 12 years ago, the Parliament created special powers in the criminal code. They're there, they get used all the time, called the preservation demand and the preservation order power. So right now, because of these two powers, police can knock on Shaw's door and say, can you hold on to all of Robert's, any data that you have pertaining to Robert for 3 weeks? They can just do that on reasonable suspicion. Or if they get a warrant on reasonable suspicion, the data can be held for 3 months. Okay, why would Parliament do that? Why would the folks backstage, like the legal advisors to the ministers, tell them that they needed this power? Why would they do that if the act of preserving your data wasn't itself an interference, right? Wasn't itself a form of surveillance? Okay, that's one reason I think, like, because there is this precedent in the law. Along those lines, we have a dicta. We have like kind of passages in Supreme Court of Canada cases. I'm thinking of Reeves, if anyone's dialed in here, where the court says, when the police seize a computer and they hold on to it for a while, that's a big deal. That's an unreasonable seizure if they don't have authority to do that because you lose control over the data, right? Like maybe there are times when you want that data erased, right? Like, I went and did this or I talked to that person, but I want that erased, right? That's part of what it is to lead a private life, right? Or to have privacy in your life.
Okay.
So
Thanks. That's amazing. I think we've got a lot of legal context there. Matt, I mean, I think one of the things I want to jump in with is I know that you and the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group and Robert and some others have been working on some letters. And then there's also some of the members of this Don't Surveil Me group here in this call that are trying to make some certain calls. I think I want to maybe try to understand what is it that we are actually, what is that is actually being asked for in terms of what could be changed in terms of going forward. I know that there's versions where there was a request to have the bill completely withdrawn. There's been other versions where it's focused on sort of amendments of more controversial provisions. Robert, to your point, there's already been some changes that have occurred between C2, both for better and for worse, coming into 22. So Matt, maybe can you just talk to us a little bit about what you are calling for, you in Open Media, and what some of the other organizations out there are calling for, and why this is so important.
Yeah, advocacy is always about deciding when you're fighting for the perfect and when you're fighting for the best achievable. And there's no right answer. At different times, you weave one way or the other. I think given how many issues there are with Bill C-22, it would have been preferable to have all of Part 2 struck. There's probably a version of Part 1 of the bill that would be tenable and would accomplish some of the lawful access purposes that our police may have. Um, But I don't want to discourage anyone and make them think like there's no reason to speak up right now. There's never been more of a reason to speak up than right now because the government has been sweating really publicly around this bill. They felt the need to put up long, detailed explanations on a lot of their platforms. They've sort of hemmed and hawed a little bit and said, oh, maybe we do need to make a few amendments just because people misunderstand the bill, of course. But, we'll make some changes. I worry those changes will be largely cosmetic, but our speaking up and advocacy can decide whether it's cosmetic now. And so I think the most important thing is that you reach out to your elected representative at the federal level, wherever you are, and let them know how you feel about this. If you happen to be in the Sunshine, or not Sunshine Coast, but if you happen to be in the island area, Elizabeth May is already very on side on this, but it's still good to tell her that you've got her back. It encourages her activity. But we really need as many people as possible to contact their MP to use either our email tool or ICLMG's call tool is also available there where they will actually connect you with your MP's office to talk to them. People should tweet about it under Bill C-22 or use whichever platform you're using. And really, like as I was saying before, that the opportunity the government's taking advantage of here, it's not even a real rationale for what they're doing. It's distraction. It's just the fact that people are not talking about this. So we've got a good, 6 days left before the final witness hearing. There's going to be a last meeting to hear witnesses on the 26th. It is possible that the committee will extend those hearings to hear from more witnesses, and we're fighting really hard for that now. If you do reach out to your MP, I think it's good to say you don't support the bill and you don't want it to pass as is, but then to list some of the specific problems you're concerned about and mention that it's gotten so little study. Some of the MPs on committee have been saying, oh gosh, we're learning some things about this bill and maybe we do need to think more about X or Y. We need to have them convinced that they actually do need to understand more here. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we need in the next week, and then there will be further engagement once they get to considering amendments and voting the bill through. Unfortunately, we're in a majority government now, where if the Liberals want to jam this bill through, they will get this bill, and then they will own the consequences of the bill that they passed. If you have a majority government, you're still responsible when you pass bad policy, and this is very bad policy that I think is going to cause some very significant privacy invasions. I certainly hope it gets a strong charter challenge. Unfortunately, some of this infrastructure of surveillance will be built in the meantime, even if it is eventually struck down by the court, because this will become legal obligations on people. We'll also fight at the Senate, but we can talk more about the Senate. It's hard for the Senate to get good amendments passed, although they do sometimes try.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks so much for that. And I mean, I think there's a big part of this that's also about the process of how this has gone through, because I know that, like, I think, Matt, I believe in one of the conversations I had with you, and you just referred to this, that there's been like much more limited space for consultations, and even actually some of the processes, Robert, that you brought up in our conversation earlier today. You mentioned that there was a report that came out, to even ask the question around whether this was needed, and the committee actually answered on some level, as I understand it, that they don't, but they want it. So, so they are going to move ahead with it because they want it. So it feels like there's a bunch of process issues coming up along the way that have the effect of potentially breaking faith with the electorate, who are trying to basically make sense of how do you kind of balance these two core issues of privacy and safety, and who want to see, like, I think, a balanced outcome. I guess my question is, what do you think that there is, given that there is a limited window on process, and given that there is sort of an interest in extending that, what could that look like? You sort of said more consultations. What else could that look like, and what kind of pressure could be brought to bear on trying to make that a reality?
Well, I'm not even saying more consultations. I'm saying literally hearing from more witnesses.
More
We've
with.
sent more than 10,000 emails to MPs. I think the JCCF, which is a right-wing group, has a petition of about 40,000 people being delivered to committee. We've not been called to testify. I don't know that JCCF has been either. To our knowledge, very few civil society groups have had a chance to speak to committee about what their concerns are. And Robert is, of course, right that there has been some consultation leading up to this bill. There's been no consultation on the metadata provisions because they were never floated before this version of the bill. And I think I would certainly hope that they would consider striking that portion. But as I said before, it is really quite unprecedented in Canadian experience. Nothing like this exists in America. This idea of everyone's metadata being retained preventatively just in case it happens to be useful to police. And, your GPS location is part of your metadata potentially, or the location of your devices, which generally amounts to your location. I think having many services, an undefined list of services in Canada, retain everyone's location for up to a year is just an extraordinary invasion of privacy that, sure, maybe courts will strike it down, but that could be 5 years down the road. There's a lot of data that could be gathered and misused by Canadians, both by government and by hackers in that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing the weaponization of data being used in the U.S. to go after enemies of the president, including things like mortgage fraud up against the Attorney General in Georgia. So I mean, there's I think just the access to that data allows that type of abuse. Robert, just before we kind of go to questions, I want to return to you. Just what would you ask of the group that's here? What do you think people can do and should be thinking about as we kind of enter these final days?
Well, I think Matt has his suggestions are terrific, and I don't think I can really add anything to them. This is absolutely the time to speak up. Um, I guess if you are concerned about how this is playing out, I think one of the things to follow is to see what the government is willing to do. What I suspect will happen is the government will amend the. We never talked about the all the concerns around the definition of systematic vulnerability, which is to say the possibility that this bill will allow the government to compel service providers to build backdoors to encryption, whether this really threatens encryption. And I think that they've now sort of heard from enough major companies and had which have made serious threats that they'll pull out of Canada, that they're going to amend the definition and to make it clearer than it is now that backdoors to encryption are off the table. So that's one. The other one is, I'd be surprised if they back down altogether on the metadata thing. What I think is more likely is that they'll amend it to say something like 30 to 60 days. I think it'll still be struck down. I think it's not going to stand because it doesn't involve individualized suspicion. So
Mhm.
if the court agrees with me that it's private, that like telling those companies to record your data is an interference with your privacy, then I think that it falls for sure. But there's no guarantee that I'm right about that. It could be that 5 judges of the court or 4 judges, if it's a 7 judge panel, say no, we don't think that's an interference. But uh,
Mhm.
but from my money, I think they will. Um, that those are two things to follow. I'm intrigued by Matt's suggestion that there's a possibility that they may abandon part two. They may abandon the whole framework of powers to tell Shaw, et cetera, to install equipment. I hope that's the case. Maybe they've been spooked by the big companies stepping in and saying, "Look, we're going to pull out if you do this." But that didn't stop them before. That didn't stop them with you know, the media bill that forced Google and Meta to pay certain amounts of money to reproduce Canadian news on Google and Facebook.
Yeah.
Facebook left and hasn't come back. So,
Mhm.
but that was the Trudeau government. So I don't know whether this is a more sensible government, but I
I would argue that that was bad policy also, because I think that they're focusing on the wrong issue there. But the right issue, they've actually also given away, in some cases, some of the ground to address it because of the way that trade agreements have been weaponized by Trump to erode the space in which policy can actually take place. I do want to turn to some of the questions here. So one of our participants indicated storytelling is the most important, powerful way to reach people and move them into action. Giving tangible actions of scenarios that could result could be really helpful. And so, in addition to this legal context, we really need a good way to talk to people who are not going to kind of get bogged down by the details. So I guess I'm curious, Matt, back to you, just maybe what's the most compelling story that you have been able to tell to help somebody who really who for whom an abstract idea of privacy is not going to be enough to kind of get them to buy into why this is important. But what are some of the stories that you find really compelling and that convince people that this is important?
People have this idea that privacy is a binary, or because we're not entirely sure what is out there about us in terms of privacy violations, then I guess it's kind of all the same and all equally bad. That is not the case. And what Canada is legislating here, if we actually force this full wave of metadata, including GPS, on every person in Canada, we could see a world a couple of years from now where it's passed the Senate, it's in effect, it was taken up by, again, we do not know which providers. And suddenly, pretty much every hack you see of a major service used in Canada, you will have to wonder, was this one of the services that was compelled by government to monitor my metadata, to retain my metadata? And if so, did a complete map of my GPS location or everyone I messaged just end up on the dark web for anyone to purchase and misuse? You know,
Mhm.
we saw a major data leak of far less sensitive information in Alberta recently that
Mhm.
led to several survivors feel like they needed to rehome themselves to make sure that their abuser could not find them.
Mhm.
That was just phone and address. That was nothing like this complete map. I mean, what are you supposed to do if you're a survivor and everywhere you've been for the last year is leaked? You never see any of the friends or go to any of the locations that you saw for the next rest of your life. It's just I'm not a survivor and I don't want to speak to that experience too deeply, but like it is extraordinary the kind of terrible things that could happen to people if we actually permit this kind of data to be retained for no good reason based off no crime.
I mean, I also imagine that because of how surveillance has just transpired more generally speaking, this would have an outsized impact on racialized communities. I guess I've been surprised because there was such a big engagement from immigration organizations and sort of organizations working against racial discrimination on Bill C-2. We haven't seen the same engagement here. And but it strikes me that there's incredibly sort of deep implications for those communities as well. Can you speak to where this has shown up in terms of police surveillance and other places and how this might get worse?
Sure. I mean, historically, the people that face the highest police surveillance in Canada are environmental activists and Indigenous protesters. There's a very long history of the RCMP spying on those folk, both around actual risk of violence, but often just simply because they are speaking up against the state. I suspect they will be a very common target of surveillance requests under this kind of legislation. Beyond that, I think Bill C-2 was an incredible moment where the government unified a lot of different groups. And unfortunately, and in my personal view, the migrant groups lost the fight against Bill C-12, their side of the two bills that were spun off from C-2. I think that was pretty crushing for many of them and has discouraged them from activism for a bit. I hope to see them re-enter the fray, but I think the Carney government is to some degree flooding the zone on these bills. And we need to keep that from just dominating the narrative. And fortunately, there's really been change. I think when people realize that Signal, something that many of us use every day, or at least we know is one of the biggest privacy signals you can have, when they realized that that was under threat and could just stop being available here, I think that activated many people to realize there was a major issue here that had to be addressed.
Okay, great. We do have a question in the chat that I will take from Rowan. Robert, this is for you. The question is it an accurate understanding that parts of C-22 could contravene GDPR and have impacts on Canada's ability to engage in European markets? And that can include, I think that'd be particularly important for Canadian businesses, but yeah, can you speak to that? Do you have any sense for that?
Great question, but it's the GDPR is so complicated, so elaborate that I think yeah, I wouldn't even sort of speculate. But a great question though.
Mm. Yeah, I do think I saw something around the equivalency agreement. So I'm going to try to find that piece and I'll share it if I once I find that on the Don't Surveil Me site with Patricia which Patricia has circulated. Okay, we are in our final minute right now. I thanks everybody for being here. I there are a couple of links that we are going to share. So if you do want to take an action, Matt, maybe I'll just let you maybe make a couple of calls here before we go.
Yeah, so from easiest to hardest calls, easiest is just doing our email campaign. It's a one-click thing. You can opt out of our list if you don't want to be on the list, and it's got a scripted message you can send, but you can also edit it with all of your personal thoughts, and please do. ICLMG has a call tool. They've got talking points that you can use where it'll connect you to your MP's office. They're probably not in the office right now, so you can leave a message, but that has a lot of impact as well. And then just the Surveil Me folk have a really great resource page out there, and you should use that. They've got a really funny video coming out soon, if it's not out already, that is worth sharing. And talk about it. Talk about it to the people in your life. No one is more convincing of other people than you talking about the specific concerns this is giving you to other people in your life who might be motivated to take action and won't take action because of me or because of Robert.
Mhm. Yeah. And Robert, do you want any final calls on your side as well?
No, I think Matt's really done a great job on that. That's great. Yeah.
Patricia, do you want to maybe just come off mute and say a moment, something quickly about the Don't Survey site?
Hey everyone, I'll just speak really quickly and just say thanks for all of the encouragement in chat and beyond for it. As just briefly mentioned, we have social assets coming out today, which will be a social shareable video, and then also a briefing document with potential actions for high leverage contacts. And so we'll be circulating those links both on the site and on those new social media channels that'll be launched the next probably hour.
And I mean, I think to the point about storytelling, if you do have stories, please share those with us because I think that I absolutely hear that. I think that the one of the questions around how do we make this more convincing is to kind of actually see where it is showing up. It already has shown up, and as Matt alluded to earlier, the way that AI then intersects with the vulnerabilities of that end up coming through this are extended in a way that are going to make Canadians a lot more vulnerable to cyber risks. So this is a very big challenge on a lot of levels. Yeah, and so yeah, thanks Patricia for getting all of that. Yeah, standing up. Patricia kind of got engaged on this last Friday and has just been a machine in the last 5 days in trying to engage and try to get more people in on this conversation. So thanks so much to them, her and Benjamin Open Civics for being here and for being part of this conversation. That's all for me. Thank you so much for being